The year was 2005, and 18-year-old Prince William stood outside the Passage, a homeless day centre in Victoria, London. His mother's voice echoed in his mind as he watched dozens of people queue for a hot meal and a warm place to sit. Diana had brought him here as a child, her hand firm in his as she introduced him to people society preferred to ignore. Now, years after her death, he was returning alone. The centre buzzed with quiet desperation. Men and women of all ages shuffled through the doors, their faces marked by stories of loss, addiction, mental illness, and simple bad luck. William watched an elderly man carefully count coins for a cup of tea, while nearby a young mother tried to keep her toddler entertained with a broken toy. The contrast between this world and his own life at Sandhurst Military Academy couldn't have been starker. Sarah Jenkins, the center's director, approached him with the no-nonsense attitude that characterized her work. She had been running the Passage for 15 years and had seen plenty of well-meaning visitors come and go. Politicians arrived with cameras, made speeches about caring for the vulnerable, and disappeared until the next election cycle. Celebrities dropped by for photo opportunities that boosted their public image. But something about Diana's son seemed different. "Your mother understood that homelessness isn't just about not having a roof over your head," Sarah told him as they walked through the center. "It's about losing your place in society, your dignity, your hope." She saw each person here as an individual with a story worth hearing. William stopped at a table where a man named James was eating soup. James had been sleeping rough for 3 years after losing his job as a construction worker following a back injury. He couldn't afford his rent, had no family support, and fell through the cracks of a system that seemed designed to help everyone except people like him. As James shared his story, William listened without the typical royal distance. He asked questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand. "The hardest part isn't the cold or the hunger," James explained, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm bowl. "It's becoming invisible. People look right through you like you don't exist. You start believing you don't matter." That conversation planted a seed in William's mind that would grow into a lifelong commitment. He began volunteering at the Passage regularly, learning about the complex web of factors that led to homelessness. He met veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress, young people who had aged out of the care system with nowhere to go, families evicted from their homes due to rising rents, and individuals battling addiction or mental health issues without adequate support. Each story revealed the same truth. Homelessness could happen to anyone. A job loss, a family breakdown, a medical emergency, or a combination of small misfortunes could push someone from stability into crisis. The safety net that should catch these falling individuals was riddled with holes, and too many people were slipping through. William's education at the Passage continued beyond his official visits. Sarah arranged for him to spend nights with outreach teams, visiting people sleeping in doorways, under bridges, and in hidden corners of the city. These midnight journeys through London revealed a parallel world existing alongside the one he knew. While tourists enjoyed West End shows and expensive dinners, people died from exposure just streets away. One particularly cold January night, the outreach team found Robert, a 72-year-old former teacher, unconscious in a shop doorway. Hypothermia had nearly claimed his life. As paramedics worked to stabilize him, William learned that Robert had been sleeping rough for 2 years after his pension proved insufficient to cover rising housing costs. A proud man who had dedicated his life to educating children, Robert had been too ashamed to ask for help until it was almost too late. The incident shook William profoundly. Here was someone who had contributed to society for decades, only to be abandoned when he needed support most. The failure wasn't just systemic, it was moral. A wealthy nation was allowing its elders to die on the streets, while politicians debated housing policies that never seemed to translate into real solutions. As his military training progressed, William found himself applying strategic thinking to the homelessness crisis. He began studying housing policies, social services, and international approaches to addressing rough sleeping. He learned about Finland's Housing First model, which provided immediate accommodation without requiring people to prove they deserved help. He studied Singapore's public housing success and Amsterdam's innovative approaches to supporting vulnerable populations. The more William learned, the more frustrated he became with Britain's approach. The system was fragmented, underfunded, and often seemed designed to manage homelessness rather than end it. Emergency shelters provided temporary relief but offered no pathway to permanent housing. Support services were difficult to navigate, with different organizations providing overlapping or competing assistance. People bounced between hostels, the streets, and temporary accommodations without ever achieving stability. During his final year at Sandhurst, William made a decision that would define his adult life. He would dedicate himself to ending homelessness, not through token charity work or occasional royal visits, but through sustained strategic action. He understood that his position as a future king gave him unique access to decision-makers and media attention. He could use this privilege to amplify voices that were usually ignored and keep the issue visible when others moved on to newer causes. His announcement surprised many within royal circles. Homelessness wasn't traditionally considered a royal cause in the same way that military charities or conservation efforts were. Some advisors worried about the political implications of criticizing government housing policies. Others questioned whether a prince could truly understand the experiences of people sleeping rough. But William had learned something important during his nights on outreach. Credibility came from consistent presence, not privileged birth. The people at the passage would judge him by his actions over time, not his title. He needed to prove that his commitment was genuine and lasting. The first test came when William received his military commission. Posted to various locations for training and service, he could have easily used distance and duty as excuses to reduce his involvement with homelessness issues. Instead, he insisted on maintaining his volunteer work, sometimes driving hours after military exercises to spend time with rough sleepers or attend strategy meetings with service providers. His commanding officers initially viewed this as an unusual hobby for a young military officer. But William's approach to homelessness work mirrored his military training. Thorough preparation, clear objectives, and commitment to mission success. He wasn't content with simply showing up and looking concerned. He wanted to understand root causes, identify effective interventions, and measure real outcomes. This systematic approach led William to some uncomfortable realizations about traditional charity models. Many well-meaning organizations were providing services that made homelessness more bearable, without addressing its underlying causes. Soup kitchens fed people who remained hungry the next day. Night shelters provided beds but no pathway to permanent housing. These services were necessary for immediate survival but insufficient for lasting change. William began advocating for what he called dignified solutions, approaches that treated homeless individuals as capable people facing temporary circumstances rather than permanent victims requiring perpetual care. This meant supporting education and job training programs, helping people access mental health services, and most importantly, creating pathways to stable housing that people could afford on realistic incomes. The transformation from privileged observer to committed advocate wasn't immediate or simple. William made mistakes, said things that revealed his limited understanding, and sometimes frustrated the very people he was trying to help. But he kept showing up, kept asking questions, and kept learning from his errors. By 2009, 4 years after his first serious encounter with homelessness, William had evolved from a well-meaning volunteer into a knowledgeable advocate. He could discuss housing policy details with government ministers, explain trauma-informed care approaches to service providers, and, most importantly, sit with someone experiencing homelessness without either party feeling awkward about the conversation. The promise he made to himself that first day at the passage had become something bigger. A commitment to use every resource available to him to ensure that no one in Britain would have to sleep rough. It was an ambitious goal that would require decades of work, political courage, and the willingness to challenge systems that many people found easier to ignore. As William looked ahead to his growing role in royal duties, he knew that homelessness would remain central to his public work. The cause had shaped his understanding of leadership, social responsibility, and the kind of king he hoped to become. He was no longer the 18-year-old who had walked nervously through the passage. He was a man with a mission that would define the next 20 years of his life. The rain hammered against the windows of Kensington Palace as Prince William spread dozens of reports across his desk. It was 2011, and he had been married to Catherine for just 6 months. While other newlyweds might have been planning honeymoons and decorating their home, William was immersed in housing statistics, mental health studies, and employment data. The numbers told a story that kept him awake at night. Homelessness in Britain was increasing despite billions spent on services and support. The official count showed over 60,000 people in temporary accommodation, but William knew the real figure was much higher. Thousands more were sleeping rough, staying in squats, or moving between friends' sofas because they had nowhere else to go. The system wasn't just failing. It was actively creating the problems it claimed to solve. Catherine found him there at 2 in the morning, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. She had grown accustomed to finding her new husband consumed by his research, but this night felt different. William looked up with the exhausted expression of someone who had discovered a truth too big to ignore. "Every night we've been celebrating our wedding, people have been dying on the streets," he said quietly. "Not from dramatic causes that make headlines, but from exposure, infection, and despair. And tomorrow politicians will debate housing policies while more people fall through the cracks." Catherine sat beside him and picked up one of the reports. It detailed the story of Maria, a woman who had worked as a nurse for 20 years before developing mental health problems following a car accident. Unable to work, she lost her apartment and found herself sleeping in her car. When the car was repossessed, she moved to the streets. Despite her professional background and willingness to accept help, she had been bouncing between emergency shelters for 3 years with no pathway to permanent housing. "What does she need?" Catherine asked, understanding that William wasn't just sharing statistics but looking for solutions. "A home," William replied simply. "Not a bed in a shelter where she has to leave every morning and queue again each evening hoping for space. Not a temporary hostel where she shares a room with strangers and can't keep her possessions safe. An actual home where she can close the door, cook her own meals, and begin rebuilding her life." This conversation marked a turning point in William's approach to homelessness. Instead of focusing on managing the crisis, he began developing a strategy to prevent it. He started meeting with economists, urban planners, and international housing experts to understand why some countries succeeded in reducing homelessness while Britain struggled with increasing numbers. His research led him to Helsinki, where he spent a week studying Finland's housing-first approach. The Finnish model was revolutionary in its simplicity. Give people homes immediately, then provide support services to help them maintain housing stability. Traditional British approaches required people to prove they were housing ready by addressing addiction, mental health issues, or unemployment before receiving permanent accommodation. Finland reversed this logic, recognizing that stable housing was necessary before people could effectively address other challenges. Juha Kakkonen, who led Finland's homelessness program, explained the philosophy during William's visit to a housing project in Helsinki. They walked through apartments occupied by formerly homeless individuals, each space personalized with furniture, photographs, and belongings that reflected the residents' personality and interests. "We realized that requiring people to get clean, get therapy, get jobs before getting homes was like asking someone to swim before throwing them the life preserver," Juha explained as they met with Mikko, a former rough sleeper who now worked as a peer counselor. "Housing is healthcare. Housing is employment support. Housing is mental health treatment. Without it, nothing else works effectively." Mikko's transformation illustrated this principle perfectly. For 8 years he had cycled through emergency shelters, treatment programs, and the streets. Despite multiple attempts at recovery, he couldn't maintain sobriety or employment, while managing the daily stress of finding safe places to sleep. Within 6 months of receiving his own apartment, he had completed addiction treatment and found part-time work. 2 years later, he was helping other formerly homeless individuals navigate their own transitions. William returned to Britain energized but frustrated. The Finnish model worked because it treated housing as a human right rather than something people needed to earn through good behavior. But implementing similar approaches in Britain would require fundamental changes to how government agencies, charities, and local councils operated. The current system was built around assessment, eligibility, and gradual progression through different types of accommodation. Housing first required immediate action and trusted people to succeed when given the chance. The challenge became finding ways to pilot new approaches within existing constraints. William began identifying local authorities willing to experiment with different models, using his position to bring together officials who rarely collaborated. He organized meetings between housing directors, health commissioners, police superintendents, and charity leaders to discuss coordinated responses to rough sleeping. One of these sessions in Birmingham led to an unexpected breakthrough. The city was spending enormous amounts managing homelessness through emergency responses. Police dealing with rough sleepers, hospitals treating preventable illnesses, and courts processing minor offenses committed by people with nowhere else to go. When they calculated the total cost of these reactive services, local officials discovered they could fund permanent housing and support services for less money than they were already spending on crisis management. This economic argument proved more persuasive than moral appeals. Politicians who dismissed helping homeless people as expensive charity work began paying attention when they realized that prevention was cheaper than management. William started commissioning detailed cost-benefit analyses that demonstrated how investment in housing could reduce spending on police, healthcare, and criminal justice services. The research phase of his work culminated in a comprehensive report that William presented to Parliament in 2013. Unlike typical royal speeches that offered general support for worthy causes, this presentation included specific policy recommendations, detailed implementation timelines, and funding proposals. William had spent 2 years developing expertise that allowed him to engage with housing policy at a technical level. His recommendations were ambitious but practical. Britain should commit to eliminating rough sleeping within 5 years through coordinated national action. Local authorities should adopt housing-first principles, providing immediate permanent accommodation, rather than requiring people to progress through temporary options. Mental health and addiction services should be integrated with housing support to address multiple challenges simultaneously. Most controversially, William proposed that housing should be treated as a public health issue, with dedicated funding and performance targets similar to healthcare services. The presentation generated significant media attention, but more importantly, it influenced policy discussions in ways that traditional charity appeals could not. Ministers found it difficult to dismiss detailed proposals from someone who had clearly done extensive research. Local government officials appreciated having royal support for innovative approaches they wanted to try but lacked political cover to implement. However, translating policy support into practical change required more than royal endorsement. William needed to demonstrate that his proposals could work in real British communities, with actual people facing complex challenges. This led to his decision to establish a demonstration project that would test housing-first principles while documenting outcomes that could inform broader policy development. Working with Centrepoint, a youth homelessness charity, William designed a pilot program focused on young people aging out of the care system. These individuals face particularly high risks of homelessness because they lacked family support networks that helped most young adults transition to independence. At 18, they were expected to manage housing, employment, education, and personal relationships without the gradual support that families typically provided. The pilot program identified 50 young people leaving care and provided them with immediate access to their own apartments, along with dedicated support workers who helped them develop life skills, pursue education or employment, and maintain their tenancies. The approach contrasted sharply with traditional models that place care leavers in hostels or shared accommodations where they often struggled with stability and security. Results emerged quickly and dramatically. Within the first year, 96% of participants maintained their housing, compared to less than 60% success rates in traditional programs. More significantly, participants were achieving outcomes that had seemed impossible in institutional settings. They were completing college courses, finding employment, and developing healthy relationships. Several became advocates for other young people, speaking at conferences and advising policymakers about care system reforms. Sarah, one of the pilot participants, exemplified these transformations. She had spent her teenage years moving between foster homes and residential facilities, never staying anywhere long enough to develop lasting relationships or educational stability. At 17, she was pregnant and facing the prospect of raising her child while homeless. The pilot program provided her with a 2-bedroom apartment 6 months before her baby was born. "Having my own key changed everything," Sarah explained during a follow-up interview. "I could plan for my baby, set up the nursery, invite my social worker for coffee instead of meeting in some office. I felt like a proper mother instead of someone who might lose her child because she couldn't provide basic stability." Sarah completed her education, found work as a teaching assistant, and became a vocal advocate for care system reform. Her success wasn't just personal. It demonstrated that given appropriate support, young people leaving care could thrive rather than simply survive. The pilot program had proven that investment in immediate housing led to better outcomes at lower long-term costs than traditional approaches. Word of the pilot's success spread through professional networks, attracting attention from other local authorities and housing providers. William found himself fielding requests to replicate the model in different contexts, working with different populations, and testing various adaptations. The demonstration project had evolved into a broader movement toward evidence-based approaches to homelessness prevention. By 2015, 10 years after his first serious engagement with homelessness issues, William had established himself as more than a well-meaning celebrity advocate. He had developed genuine expertise, built networks of professional relationships, and created practical models that were influencing policy development across the country. The foundation he had built during this period would prove crucial as homelessness numbers began rising again, driven by austerity policies, housing market pressures, and economic uncertainty. The stage was set for the next phase of his work, scaling successful approaches while advocating for the systemic changes needed to end homelessness permanently. William understood that demonstration projects and pilot programs could prove concepts, but eliminating homelessness required political commitment, adequate funding, and cultural shifts in how society viewed its responsibilities to vulnerable citizens. The real test of his 20-year commitment was about to begin. The homeless camp stretched for nearly a mile along the south bank of the Thames, just minutes from Parliament. It was December 2017, and Prince William stood among the tents and makeshift shelters, his breath visible in the freezing air as he listened to stories that revealed the devastating impact of government austerity policies. This wasn't supposed to happen in modern Britain, yet here were hundreds of people living rough in the shadow of political power. Marcus, a former construction worker, explained how he had lost his council flat after housing benefit cuts left him unable to afford the rent. Despite working full-time, his wages couldn't cover the shortfall created by government policy changes. "I went from having a home and a job to sleeping under Waterloo Bridge in 6 weeks," he told William, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had fought a system designed to defeat him. "The politicians who made these decisions drive past me every day on their way to work." William had watched homelessness numbers climb steadily since 2010 as successive conservative governments implemented spending cuts that they claimed would reduce national debt and improve economic efficiency. Housing benefit was reduced, social services were defunded, mental health support was slashed, and local councils saw their budgets cut by 40%. The result was predictable. The safety net that had prevented many people from falling into homelessness was systematically dismantled. The royal family traditionally avoided direct political commentary, but William found himself in an impossible position. His 15 years of work on homelessness had given him expertise that few politicians possessed, yet protocol required him to remain neutral while watching policies he knew would cause harm. The tension between his role as future king and his commitment to ending homelessness had reached a breaking point. Catherine joined him on many of these visits, bringing her own perspective on how homelessness affected children and families. She had become particularly concerned about the rising number of families in temporary accommodation, where children moved frequently between hostels and bed-and breakfast rooms that were unsuitable for studying, playing, or developing normally. The housing crisis was creating a generation of children whose education and development were disrupted by constant instability. During a visit to a family in temporary accommodation in Manchester, they met 8-year-old Tommy, who had changed schools 4 times in 2 years as his family was moved between different hostels. His mother, Jennifer, had been working as a cleaner until her landlord sold the property, and she couldn't find anywhere else she could afford. Despite being employed and desperately wanting to provide stability for her son, she had been trapped in the temporary accommodation system for 18 months. "Tommy doesn't bring friends home because he's ashamed of where we live," Jennifer explained as her son played quietly in the corner of their cramped room. "He doesn't understand why we can't stay in one place like other families. I don't know how to explain that working hard isn't enough anymore." These encounters fueled William's growing frustration with political responses that treated homelessness as an unavoidable side effect of economic necessity, rather than a choice that could be made differently. He began studying how other countries managed economic pressures without creating homelessness crises, discovering that many European nations maintained strong social safety nets even during difficult economic periods. Germany, despite facing economic challenges following reunification, had reduced homelessness through coordinated federal and regional policies that guaranteed housing rights. Denmark had maintained low homelessness rates while implementing welfare reforms by ensuring that housing support remained robust. Even during the 2008 financial crisis, these countries protected vulnerable populations instead of making them bear the cost of economic recovery. William's research convinced him that Britain's homelessness crisis was not inevitable, but resulted from political choices that prioritized deficit reduction over social protection. This realization led him to take increasingly bold public positions that pushed the boundaries of traditional royal neutrality. His speeches began including indirect but unmistakable criticism of government policies, carefully worded to avoid direct political attack while making his position clear. In a 2018 speech at the Royal Institute of British Architects, William spoke about housing as a fundamental human right that society had an obligation to protect. A civilized nation, he said, can be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. When we have people sleeping rough while luxury apartments stand empty, when families are forced into unsuitable temporary accommodation, while speculative investors buy properties they never intend to occupy, we must ask whether our priorities reflect our values. The speech generated significant media coverage and political commentary. Government ministers avoided direct criticism of William but defended their policies as necessary for long-term economic stability. Opposition politicians praised his comments while carefully avoiding any suggestion that he was supporting their positions. The royal household received both criticism for allowing political commentary and praise for addressing urgent social issues. Behind the scenes, William was working to build coalitions that could influence policy regardless of which party held power. He organized meetings between Conservative MPs concerned about rough sleeping in their constituencies and Labour councils implementing innovative housing programs. He brought together business leaders worried about homelessness affecting their workforce and charity leaders with detailed knowledge of effective interventions. One particularly significant gathering brought together the mayors of major British cities to share experiences and coordinate regional responses to homelessness. Manchester's Andy Burnham had committed to eliminating rough sleeping in his city and was pioneering new approaches to rapid rehousing. Birmingham's leaders were experimenting with social impact bonds that attracted private investment in homelessness prevention. Liverpool was integrating mental health services with housing support to address complex needs more effectively. These mayors found that sharing strategies and coordinating approaches achieved better results than competing for limited resources. William's role in facilitating these connections proved crucial, because local political rivalries often prevented collaboration that could benefit all communities. His position allowed him to convene meetings that might not otherwise occur and encourage cooperation across party lines. The impact of this network became apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic, when these mayors worked together to implement rapid housing programs that brought thousands of rough sleepers into safe accommodation. The Everyone In campaign demonstrated what was possible when political will, adequate resources, and coordinated action were combined. Within weeks, local authorities had housed more homeless individuals than traditional approaches had achieved in years. However, the pandemic's success also highlighted how temporary political attention differed from sustained commitment. As immediate health concerns decreased, funding for the emergency housing programs was reduced, and many people who had been housed during lockdowns faced returning to the streets. William watched with growing anger as short-term political calculations undermined long-term solutions that everyone knew were more effective and less expensive. His frustration reached a peak during a meeting with government ministers in late 2020. Despite overwhelming evidence that housing-first approaches worked better than traditional models, despite successful pilot programs across multiple cities, despite cost-benefit analyses showing long-term savings, the government continued to fund temporary measures rather than permanent solutions. "We have proven that we can end homelessness," William told the ministers, his usual diplomatic tone replaced by barely controlled anger. "We have the models, we have the evidence, we have local authorities ready to implement comprehensive programs. What we don't have is political courage to commit to solutions that extend beyond the next election cycle. The meeting marked a turning point in William's approach to advocacy. Instead of working within existing political constraints, he began explicitly calling for systemic change that would require governments to prioritize long-term outcomes over short-term political gains. His speeches became more direct in challenging policies that created homelessness while claiming to address it. Working with academic researchers, William commissioned a comprehensive study of homelessness policies across developed nations, examining which approaches were most effective at reducing rough sleeping and preventing people from becoming homeless initially. The research confirmed what his practical experience had suggested. Countries that treated housing as a public good, rather than a private commodity, achieved better outcomes at lower costs. The study's findings were published as Housing Justice: Learning from International Success, a report that became required reading for anyone serious about homelessness policy. It demonstrated that Britain's approach was not only ineffective, but actively harmful, creating cycles of crisis and intervention that consumed resources while failing to achieve lasting solutions. More importantly, the report provided detailed blueprints for alternative approaches that could be implemented immediately if political will existed. William began traveling internationally to study successful programs firsthand, bringing British officials with him to see what was possible when housing was prioritized as social infrastructure rather than market commodity. A visit to Vienna revealed how social housing could provide high-quality, affordable homes for working families, rather than just emergency accommodation for people in crisis. 60% of Vienna residents lived in social housing that was integrated throughout the city, avoiding the concentrated poverty that characterized British social housing estates. The program was financially sustainable, politically popular across parties, and had virtually eliminated homelessness in the city. They understand that good housing is economic infrastructure, William observed during a meeting with Vienna's housing officials. When people have stable, affordable homes, they're more productive at work, their children do better in school, they're healthier and require less medical care. Housing investment pays for itself through better social and economic outcomes. These international experiences reinforce William's conviction that Britain's homelessness crisis resulted from political choices rather than economic necessities. Other countries faced similar economic pressures but chose to protect housing security rather than sacrifice it for short-term savings. The question was not whether better approaches were possible, but whether British politicians would choose to implement them. As 2021 approached, marking 15 years since William had committed himself seriously to homelessness issues, he decided to escalate his advocacy to a level that would force political action, or at least ensure that voters understood the true cost of current policies. The next phase of his work would require him to risk his reputation, challenge constitutional conventions, and potentially face criticism for exceeding traditional royal boundaries. But William had learned that some issues were too important for diplomatic silence. Homelessness was getting worse, not better, despite years of his careful work within the system. The time had come to challenge the system itself, regardless of the personal or institutional consequences. The next 5 years would test everything he had built and determine whether his 20-year commitment could achieve the transformational change he had envisioned. The text message arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a bitter February morning in 2022. David found dead under railway bridge. Hypothermia. Third one this week. Prince William stared at his phone in the darkness of his bedroom, feeling the weight of 17 years of work crashing down around him. David had been one of the rough sleepers he had known personally, a former soldier who struggled with PTSD and had been failed repeatedly by systems that promised help but delivered bureaucracy. Catherine stirred beside him as William quietly dressed and prepared to leave. She had grown accustomed to these emergency calls over the years, but lately they seemed more frequent and more devastating. The pandemic had temporarily reduced visible homelessness as people were housed in emergency accommodation. But as those programs ended, the crisis had returned with unprecedented severity. How many more? Catherine asked softly, knowing that William kept a mental count of people he had known who had died on the streets. 43, William replied, his voice hollow. 43 people I've met personally who are dead, because we couldn't figure out how to give them homes in one of the world's wealthiest countries. The drive through London's empty streets took William past doorways where he knew people were sleeping, Past buildings that stood empty while property speculators waited for values to rise. Past offices where politicians would arrive in a few hours to debate policies that treated human beings as statistics. The contrast between his heated car and the freezing conditions faced by rough sleepers felt obscene. At the makeshift memorial growing near the bridge where David had died, William found a small gathering of people who had known him. There was Margaret, who had shared meals with David at various day centers, and Tony, who had served with him in Afghanistan before both men found themselves homeless years later. Their stories revealed a man who had fought for his country abroad only to be abandoned by it at home. David used to say that being homeless was harder than combat because at least in Afghanistan, he knew who the enemy was. Tony explained as they stood among flowers and handwritten messages. Here, the enemy was invisible. It was policies and procedures and waiting lists and assessments that never led anywhere. He died fighting a war nobody wanted to acknowledge. William had heard similar stories countless times, but this morning felt different. Standing in the cold at 5 a.m., surrounded by people whose lives demonstrated the complete failure of everything he had worked toward, he realized that incremental change and diplomatic advocacy were not enough. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed, managing homelessness rather than ending it, maintaining a crisis that justified the existence of countless organizations and government departments. The memorial service for David later that week became a turning point in William's approach to homelessness advocacy. Speaking to an audience that included rough sleepers, service providers, politicians, and journalists, he abandoned the carefully diplomatic language that had characterized his previous speeches. "David died because we chose to let him die," William said, his voice carrying an anger that surprised even those who knew him well. Not through deliberate cruelty, but through the collective decision to accept homelessness as inevitable rather than commit to ending it. "We have spent millions studying homelessness, managing homelessness, and talking about homelessness while people freeze to death streets away from heated offices where those discussions take place." The speech marked the beginning of what media would later call William's radical phase. Though he saw it simply as choosing honesty over diplomacy, he began speaking directly about the political and economic systems that created homelessness, naming specific policies and challenging politicians to defend approaches that everyone knew were failing. His criticism extended beyond government policy to include his own institution's role in perpetuating inequality. The royal family owned vast estates while people slept rough, and William began questioning how this wealth could be leveraged to address housing crises, rather than simply maintained for future generations. He proposed opening royal properties to emergency accommodation, and using royal lands for social housing development. The proposals generated intense debate within royal household management, with traditional advisors warning that political advocacy could undermine the monarchy's constitutional position. But William had reached a point where constitutional conventions seemed less important than constitutional obligations to protect vulnerable citizens. Working with legal experts, he argued that preventing homelessness fell within the Crown's historic responsibility to ensure the welfare of the realm. Medieval concepts of royal duty to protect subjects from harm could be applied to modern housing crises, particularly when government policies were actively creating those crises. This historical argument provided constitutional cover for increasingly direct political intervention. When the government announced further cuts to housing benefit in 2022, William issued a statement calling the policy morally indefensible and economically counterproductive. When local authorities began evicting families from temporary accommodation due to budget pressures, he personally intervened with housing ministers. The intervention that received most attention involved the planned closure of a day center in Birmingham that served over 200 homeless individuals daily. Local council budget cuts threatened to end funding for the facility, which provided not just meals and shelter but also mental health support, job training, and housing assistance that had helped hundreds of people transition off the streets. William arrived unannounced at the day center on the morning it was scheduled to close, bringing media attention that local politicians had hoped to avoid. He spent the day serving meals, meeting with people who wail in the heart of London, where million-pound apartments tower over cardboard shelters. A future king walks among the forgotten. 20 years ago, a young prince made a promise that would challenge centuries of royal tradition. Tonight, as rain pounds the streets of Westminster, that same prince stands before a crowd of politicians, activists, and survivors, ready to reveal the shocking truths he's discovered about homelessness in modern Britain. What he's about to say will expose the hidden failures of a system meant to protect its most vulnerable citizens. His words will ignite controversy, challenge the government, and prove that some fights are worth 20 years of your life. This is not just another royal speech. This is a declaration of war against an epidemic that claims lives in the shadows of palaces. The homeless crisis in Britain has reached a breaking point, and Prince William is about to tell the world exactly why the system is broken, who's responsible for fixing it, and what he's willing to sacrifice to make it happen. Tonight everything changes.